Today's video on this Sunday is gonna be about Mythic Plus, our weekly update on how things are going in Mythic Plus, gaining even more value, because today we have something to compare it with. Not just compare it with how things have been going last week, which might as well have been going on the same, but also compare it with how things might change in just a few days, because we have balance tuning coming our way. As we mentioned yesterday, some of the bigger highlights in terms of buffs. We have gotten Feral Druid buffed, we have gotten Retribution Paladin buffed, we've also gotten Shadow Priest, but also Arms Warrior, all receiving some decent buffs, not to mention some more damage and healing to healers, in particular Retro Shaman and Holy Priest. So we can go and take a look not just at how things have been changing so far, but also taking in mind how things might change given the tuning that is going to happen in just a few days. So this is the week of basically today. So this is this current week that we are in for Tyrannical, Afflicted and Bolstering. We are now basically a bit over halfway through the week. This is about 4 days into the week. You can see the total runs of the week not being nearly as high, nearly as filled as the 4,000 max of last week and all of the previous weeks. So we're not quite there yet. So if we go to our previously completed filled week, the fortified week with Storming and Bursting, you can see that the gap with Havoc with the other spec continues to be more or less on the same level. Before the spec was nerfed, it was a solid, healthy 10%. Now it's 7 to 8% with Outlaw Rogue being closer than before, but the specs haven't changed too much. Even if we go looking at the numbers, the main change, as we pointed out, was Fire Mage becoming overall closer and closer to being part of one of the meta choices. Talking about the specs that can or will be affected by the balance tuning, it's going to be an interesting pick, because Red Paladin, for example, is going to be buffed in a few days by upwards of 6 to 7%, so this number is bound to get even closer now on average with the top 3 specs of this season. Survival in terms of damage is also being buffed by the patch. You also have Unholy being buffed, you also have Forced Decay being buffed, together with Arms Warrior being buffed, as well as Shadow Priest. These are the specs we can keep an eye out on for the next week to see how much they are changing compared to these numbers prior to the buffs. For once, it's also relevant to go and take a look at the average DPS of healers, perhaps going down to a more filled, complete week, especially in Fortified, where damage to trash mobs is more important. You can see that across this, you're gonna have the buffs in damage to all 3 of these specs. Holy Paladin is getting buffed by upwards of 10%, and then you have Holy Priest getting buffed in damage by upwards of 5 to 6%, and then you have Retro Shaman getting buffed also upwards of 10% more damage. So these numbers are bound to get closer to 40,000, and this one is bound to get into the 32,000. Obviously, at first glance, it still looks like it's a far cry from the 50 plus K of, what a surprise, the top 3 healers right now in the meta. So despite the buffs, to be clear, they're still not really going to catch these healers, especially due to the advantage of these 3 healers, Discipline and Mistweaver. Both have damage as part of the rotation. Resto Druid can do damage very easily with Adaptive Swarm and Sunfire spreading around the packs, and then benefit from healing through HOTS, as well as being able to summon their 3 ends while in cat form to do damage. So these 3 specs just have an innate advantage, a cheat advantage in terms of damaging. So the buffs to these specs would have to be much larger than what they are getting now in terms of damage. It's relevant of the specs that will be changed when looking at the meta, when looking at the popularity, that across all of the specs that are receiving positive changes this next reset, the one that is seeing already more play out of all of them is RET. Most of the other specs getting buffed, you won't even be able to read in the actual text because they are so tiny. Resto Shaman, Holy Priest, Blood Decay and Protection Warrior being buffed, you can't see them. What about the DPS specs? DPS specs like Unholy, like Frost Decay, like Shadow Priest. We can see the percentage of Shadow, we can't even read their name. That's how unpopular they are, together with something like Feral that's missing, Survival that's missing. So in terms of popularity, of course, it's gonna be a long road It's gonna be a long road for any of these specs to grow significantly after getting buffed, because, you know, some of these other specs that have grown, they already had some presence before. For example, Fire, right before Fire was buffed, you know, they already had some popularity in keys. Even something like Red Paladin started growing a little bit over time, even Windwalker. So some of these other specs will have a bit of a harder time being more visible when we go through the overall season's tier lists over the different ones. They will have a bit more time climbing from the bottom pits in which they are now. You know, all of these specs being buffed, for example, in the next reset. It will take a while. As we mentioned yesterday, being a bit surprised by a couple of the buffs because the specs were already doing fine overall. For example, having Resto Shaman being buffed in healing, which was already doing very well in the raid, but also Red Paladin getting buffed in damage, which was already doing quite well in Mythic Plus at the moment. As we pointed out, is the only one with pretty good results at the moment of the specs being buffed. Most of the other specs, most of their buffs have gone to basically the bottom pack. Pretty much in this bottom pack, the majority basically of the specs receiving a buff are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Basically just towards the bottom. Even if you change the site and you change the tier list from Archon over to u.gg and you look at the performance, the ones being buffed are here, 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 and here. So still at the bottom. And the exception is RET, which is getting buffed while being still towards the top. So that is what we can see for Mythic Plus in terms of changes from one week to the next. Looking at this week, which has gotten some random, honestly, some random spikes in numbers, especially for RET, for example, in Mythic Plus, and also for Resto Shaman a little bit in Mythic Plus, due to how well can they deal with the afflicted with Poison Cleansing Totem, being able to cleanse both of them at once. What is perhaps more visible but expected, since we have pointed out before the growth of Fire Mage, which this week actually goes down by quite a lot to make space for supposedly Red Paladin, is Augmentation. Augmentation this week is currently hitting at 12%. Now, Augmentation has never before, since the inception, since the creation of Augmentation, has never gotten so low. In Season 2, or patch 10.1.5, after Augmentation was released, they never dropped below 26%. Not even in the last week of the season, where the stuff became way more random at the end of the season, Augmentation was still there. Even at the beginning of the season, it started out slow, but then gained dominance throughout the season, very solid, and then now it's going on the decline. It has lost more and more spots over to mages, to Demolox now as well, losing more spots to Red Paladins. So the grip in the top composition spots with an Augmentation Evoker is not nearly as prevalent as before. Now, it's not really true for the very top level, but it is very, very, very few players. So you really shouldn't feel the impact of all of the top key levels, or most of the top keys being done right now, still having an Augmentation Evoker in pretty much every key. But, you know, outside of this very high level, Augmentation Evoker is losing out way more to more specs, to a larger variety of options when it comes to DPS choices. That's why it's gonna be interesting to see, once we are done with the balance tuning of next week and we start seeing the results, if any of this is going to change. Obviously, the biggest bets, the biggest bucks are put on Red Paladin, given they get one of the larger buffs, but also they already are quite ahead of the rest. So it would take more for specs like Survival, specs like DK, Unholy, or Frost, or specs like Feral to gain way more popularity in the keys compared to something like Red Paladin. That is perhaps where we might put our eyes on when it comes to DPS changes. When it comes to healer changes, I mean, Holy Priest being buffed and Resto Shaman being buffed, we might see more of them overall. We might start maybe to even start seeing their letters in here. Holy Priest is just barely showing up with a number. Resto Shaman before didn't even have a number, you couldn't even see it. Maybe we might start to see the first letter of their word, you know, like FU, like the FU of Fury Warrior, for example, maybe, but definitely not enough to start contesting the top 3 healers in Mythic Plus. Talking about dungeons, Good to know that our Murzon's Rise is still the hardest of the dungeons, even on this week, but it's also good to know, unironically, that it's much closer now. We were talking about this dungeon being the hardest one in the 60-ish% range of success rate. Now it's up to 80%. So now we are closer to a more healthy curve of difficulty overall. From 93 to 80, it's more manageable. You know, if we even just go back just 3 weeks or so, 3 weeks ago, the curve was way more spread, and then we started going backwards even longer, and the curve was even more stretched. So now it's it's better, it's closer, they are closer to each other. I didn't even have time to refresh it once, and it's already losing a point of percentage. Let's close the video fast before this goes down back to 70%. Please stop depleting keys of Murzon's Rise as I make this video, and stop making this percentage go down. Thank you. This week we are seeing something interesting in terms of compositions, perhaps skewed by a few requirements, like for example Afflicted. But overall, if we even go back just 3 weeks ago, you see that there was more of a choice for healers and more of a choice for tanks. Even if we go prior to or at the beginning of the buffs of fire basically wasn't even there, and then over time we're now gotten to the point where fire is present in almost every single one of the more popular compositions in Mythic Plus. What's also surprising now is RET, because if we go back the week before, RET is basically not there, and then this week RET is present, which is kind of what we noticed here. RET almost tripling their numbers in this week. Again, it might have to do with the presence of Afflicted, of a Dispel being required, something that, Havoc cannot really do, something that Demo, for example, cannot really do, but RET can do with the Poison Dispel, Fire can do with Curse Dispel, so that does definitely help the group. Interesting though that Protection Paladin can also help the group with the Dispel, but never mind, Vengeance is still the popular pick for this week. We can even look at just the healer tank overall combo. You can see the Vengeance Discipline at 5000 run compared to Vengeance Holy Priest at 1600 or Vengeance Holy Paladin at 1600, for example. The numbers of the 3 most played healers with Vengeance are quite higher than the numbers of the 3 most played healers with Protection Paladin. You can then look at the same when it comes to DPS with the different triple comp, different triple options, without having to count also the tank and the healer together with these guys, and rating them by their popularity right now in this week only. Of course, this is still a nice tool for you to see which type of comp you might have depending on the buffs you want. For example, if I am playing Vengeance, or if I have a Vengeance in my group and I myself am a Discipline Priest, and we kind of want still both Battle Res and Bloodlust, which are going to be the 2 most picked choices for having those buffs. Or maybe you can do the opposite, the weird opposite, where you have your Combat Res in Protection Paladin and you have your Bloodlust in Restoration Shaman, and you see who gets brought to the key in case you're interested yourself. This is what we have in terms of most popular comps in Mythic Plus for this Afflicted bolstering week of Tyrannical. As mentioned, it was good to go through all of the different sets of data and numbers and updates for this week, not just to see what is changing right now, but also to notice what might be changing based on the balance tuning that's about to happen in a few days, so that we can then go back, perhaps not a week from now, but maybe a couple of weeks from now, so that we can then say, okay, before the buffs, Feral used to be here, and Frost used to be here, and Arms used to be here. How much changed after they received their buffs, right? That's also something relevant to keep in mind on when we go in our weekly updates of Mythic Plus or the raid, to also check on the specs that are about to receive some changes, so we can then compare them later on and see just how much they were affected by these buffs or these nerfs, depending on the tuning. So for today, on this Sunday, this is what we have on our update of Mythic Plus, our recap on week 10, I believe, of the season. Besides this, I am now going to leave you to the rest of the last day of your weekend. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help. They've got to the channel, which can also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, I hate it when I make myself some hot tea, I forget about it, I pick it up to drink, and I realize it's cold all of a sudden.